Hi everyone, Varkeen here. The Spellblade is one of my favorite character archetypes in games. I love the fantasy of dashing into a group of enemies, slashing them with a sword, unleashing a magical blast, and dashing away. In Path of Exile, I haven't come across builds that quite capture that feel for me. So I'd like to share my approach to the archetype with this Spellblade champion. This is my very first build guide, so I hope you enjoy. My goals for this build were to have it be a decent mapper, be able to defeat the Maven, handle 100% Crucible on T16 maps, and focus on the gameplay feel of a Spellblade. I ended up building this version with full uniques, but it could probably be improved with some properly crafted gear. You can start playing the general build once you hit level 62 if you have the core uniques. Overall, the endgame version I'll be showing here cost me less than 10 divines. The POB is linked in the description. Fair warning though, this is a multi-button build, so if that sounds fine to you, let's dive in. The core engine of this build centers around Kitava's Thirst and the Searching Thoughts. Kitava's Thirst is a helmet that gives 50% chance to trigger socketed spells when you spend at least 100 mana on an upfront cost to use or trigger a skill. The triggered spells automatically target enemies, and this effect will trigger all socketed spells at the same time, up to the 4 maximum sockets in the helm. This behavior is unique and can be quite powerful when you consider that if you link multiple spells in other common trigger setups like Cast on Critical Strike, they will cycle through and only trigger one spell at a time. We're going to use the unique effect on this helmet as the main source of damage for the build, but to do that we need to spend an incredible amount of mana, and we're going to make this happen with a melee attack. This is where the Surging Thoughts comes in. The Surging Thoughts is the upgraded version of the Rippling Thoughts, which is a sword that you can collect the pieces to make by completing the unique Beachhead Harbinger map. This sword really embodies the idea of an actual Spellblade, since it lets you trigger level 20 Storm Cascade with every attack. Storm Cascade deals base physical damage, which is fully converted to lightning damage. When you trigger the spell with an attack, it creates 5 sequential bursts of lightning along a line away from the character. While this might look like a projectile, it's not. Each burst creates an area of effect, and with some increased area of effect, the burst can overlap. Normally, Storm Cascade has no mana cost, but we can give it one by socketing Archmage support into the sword. Archmage can support triggered spells, and causes the base mana cost of the skill to be equal to 5% of your unreserved mana. Adding another support like Hex Touch further multiplies the mana cost and allows us to apply a defensive or offensive curse of our choice whenever we hit with Storm Cascade. With enough unreserved mana, we can push the mana cost to over 100 mana. Now, each attack we perform triggers Storm Cascade, providing the mana to help quench Kitava's Thirst and trigger spells. This core mechanic is flexible and allows us to use any melee attack and most spell skills in Kitava's Thirst, as long as they're non-channeled or non-aura spells. For my version of the Spellblade, I decided to lean into Lightning to synergize with Storm Cascade. Since Surging Thoughts has a slow attack speed, I went with Frenzy as my attack skill to generate Frenzy charges. Frenzy charges scale Frenzy's attack speed, increases our general attack speed, and grants us a global damage multiplier. Using Divergent Frenzy grants an additional strike, which auto-targets nearby enemies, and really helps to smooth out the feel of melee Frenzy. We have to be a little careful with how fast we attack though. Storm Cascade's cooldown is 0.25 seconds, so we need to make sure we don't go above 3.78 attacks per second, or we'll start getting some inconsistent triggers. You can fine-tune attack speed by controlling the level and quality of the faster attack support gem. For the spells in Kitava's Thirst, I chose Val Arc and Lightning Conduit. Arc gives us a reliable clear skill, and once we've gained enough souls, manually casting Val Arc feels great, blasting whole screens at a time. Whenever we use Val Arc, we also get a buff that makes Arc's damage lucky for a few seconds. This lucky buff rolls the damage on Arc twice and takes a higher number for the final damage result. Lightning Conduit puts out high damage and is also a good AoE skill, but it requires you to consistently shock enemies to work. If you can do that, then it removes or consumes that shock to give you a big damage multiplier. On its own, shock is an effect that causes enemies to take increased damage. If we have % chance to shock on our items, skills, or passives, then we can inflict shock as an elemental ailment if we deal enough lightning damage to an enemy. Critical strikes with lightning damage always inflict shock, but for this build we're going non-crit. Luckily, the core setup that we have lets us reliably shock enemies and immediately reapply a new shock, all with a single trigger. To see how this works, let's slow things way down and go visit Hillock. Let's see what happens when we trigger Kitava's Thirst with our attack. Storm Cascade hits first and applies a shock. Then Lightning Conduit triggers, removes the shock and deals damage. With increased AoE, Storm Cascade hits a second time and applies a new shock. But what if Storm Cascade didn't apply shock? Let's say we didn't have 100% shock chance. That's not a problem. We have another opportunity to shock with the Arc spell socketed into Kitava's Thirst. Here, I'm triggering Kitava's Thirst without attacking by spending at least 100 mana through Zealotry linked to Divine Blessing. When Kitava's Thirst triggers all its socketed spells at once, it allows Lightning Conduit to remove shocks applied by Arc's damage. This is another way we can get Lightning Conduit to do damage with a single button press. But Kitava's Thirst has a 50% chance to trigger, and damage can feel inconsistent if you run into an unlucky streak rolling that 50-50. To improve our odds, we can add Prismatic Burst linked to Frenzy. Prismatic Burst triggers an Area of Effect spell on a target when we hit with a supported attack. When we support this with another Archmage gem, we can give Prismatic Burst a mana cost. Now we have two separate spells that spend at least 100 mana each when we use or hit with Frenzy, Storm Cascade and Prismatic Burst. If Prismatic Burst is off cooldown, this lets us roll the 50-50 twice per Frenzy attack that hits, improving the effective trigger chance on Kitava's Thirst up to 75%. All of this costs a hefty amount of mana, so how do we sustain it? To start, we can make it so that we have a chance to recover 10% of our maximum mana whenever we use a skill. This modifier is one of the mana masteries, and you can also get it on a Watcher's Eye that applies while you're affected by Clarity. We're also going to make it so that we get mana back whenever we take damage from hits, by getting % damage taken recouped as mana. Here, we can get 10% by taking another mana mastery, and another 10% by speccing into the notable passive, Battle Rouse. We also want to get mana whenever we kill enemies. By using Atziri's Splendor for our chest slot, we get 100 mana for each enemy killed. If we're only squaring off against one enemy, we can help our mana sustain by getting mana leech from attack damage by anointing Spirit Void on our amulet. Finally, this build uses the Clarity aura and specs into increased maximum mana and mana regen nodes on the passive tree. Combining all these together, our mana sustain ends up being pretty comfortable, allowing us to run map mods that completely disable mana regeneration, mana leech, or decrease recovery rates. To deal damage, we focus on stats, skills, and effects that improve our lightning and spell damage. Our sword is complemented in our offhand by Singularity. This is a unique scepter that provides a large boost to flat lightning damage to spells, as well as an effect that hinders any nearby enemies. Since we're often in melee range, we can benefit from the large increased damage bonus it grants against hindered enemies. For our gloves, Algrim Mortis increases non-damaging ailments for bigger shocks, as well as increases the damage taken by enemies in our chilling areas. To spread those chilling areas, we use Frostblink, Arctic Armor, and the Commandment of Spite glove enchant. When we're hit, Commandment of Spite drops chilled ground that radiates out like spokes, covering a large area. We can also gain a lot of power by boosting the level of our gems. With Val Arc and Lightning Conduit socketed into Kitava's Thirst, corruptions that increase lightning, duration, and AoE gem levels help a lot. We can boost Val Arc or Lightning Conduit by 4 levels with the right combination of corruptions. With the revamp to the Val Temple map, these kinds of double corruptions have been much more feasible to acquire through trade. If this double corruption is hard to find, or if you're on a budget, you can get a lot of value out of using one with just the +2 to socketed lightning gems. Since we're reusing Atziri's Splendor, the implicit modifier +1 to level all Val skill gems bumps up Val Arc by another level. This build also uses Smite, which buffs us with an aura that gives shock chance and flat lightning damage when we use it. Using the Val version grants even more flat lightning damage to the aura, which scales with gem level. It also allows us to benefit from the +1 to all Val skills from Atziri's Splendor. Since Val Smite is tagged as an aura, we can gain another 5 levels by socketing it into March of the Legion. We can gain additional levels if we find one corrupted with increases to duration, AoE, aura, or all socketed gems. Plus, Val Smite is a really fun skill to use. It's an attack, but it still helps contribute to the Spellblade feel. I love using it with the Valkyrie skill effect MTX. It's just so cool slamming the ground and calling down spears of lightning from the sky. March of the Legion also supports socketed gems with Divine Blessing, letting us use the Zealotry aura as a temporary buff by spending mana instead of reserving mana. We can add the Wrath aura for more lightning damage by using the variant of All's Uprising that causes Wrath to have no reservation. This also allows us to take advantage of the Watcher's Eye mod that grants lightning penetration while affected by Wrath. Since we're going with the Champion Ascendancy, we can allocate Inspirational to increase the effect of our non-curse auras, improving the damage and benefits we gain from the Smite, Zealotry, and Wrath auras. Anathema sets our curse limit to our maximum number of power charges, letting us run with at least 3 curses with the default maximum of 3 power charges. For our other ring, we're using Mark of Submission, allowing us to automatically apply a full strength level divergent conductivity on hit, lowering monster lightning resistance and adding a big bonus to shock chance against cursed enemies. Combined with mana stacking and using the lightning mastery that applies a portion of increases to maximum mana as shock effect, we can inflict some pretty large shocks even on pinnacle bosses. To squeeze in some extra damage, we apply elemental weakness on hit by socking it into Searching Thoughts with Hex Touch to reduce enemy lightning resist even further. We also get the summon Greater Harbinger of the Arcane skill from Searching Thoughts, and if we use it, we get a friendly Harbinger that follows us around and gives us a buff that grants some shock chance and lightning penetration. The buff has about a 50% uptime. For Keystone passives, up near the top of the tree, we allocate Elemental Overload for more elemental damage if we've dealt a critical strike recently. Uptime on Elemental Overload is pretty good, since we have some increased critical strike chance against nearby enemies from our amulet, and the Zealotry aura grants increased spell critical strike chance. Towards the center of the passive tree, we pick up Iron Will. This allows our strength bonus to apply to spell damage. For our Timeless Jewel, we use Lethal Pride. Any of the variants will do, since we're not using it for a specific keystone. In addition to adding strength to the small passives in range of Lethal Pride, this jewel also adds special bonuses to the notables in its area. We can take advantage of this since we're going to end up with a lot of notables in the region just below the duelist start. I recommend trying to find a Lethal Pride that has multiple chance to deal double damage mods on the notables here. We spend a lot of our time in melee range and have to stand still to attack, so how do we survive? This build takes a hybrid life energy shield approach and splits the damage we take between life, energy shield, and mana at the same time. Let's take a look at how this works. We'll visit Hillock again and be his punching bag. Normally, energy shield protects our life pool from taking non-chaos damage, while chaos damage fully bypasses energy shield. Hillock's punches deal physical damage, only dealing damage to our life once our energy shield runs out. Burden of Truth is a belt that allows a portion of non-chaos damage to pass through energy shield, as well as prevents a portion of chaos damage from bypassing energy shield. If we put the belt on, some of Hillock's damage now passes through our energy shield and is taken from our life. By speccing the Mind Over Matter Keystone, a portion of damage taken from our life is further split and taken from mana instead. By splitting the damage this way, we can take advantage of life recovery and mana recovery to heal the damage we take. Otherwise, these forms of recovery would only help during the windows of time when our energy shield is depleted. Our next layer of defense focuses on ways to take less damage. From the Champion Ascendancy, we allocate Fortitude to be permanently fortified, causing us to take less damage from hits. On the way there, we get Unstoppable Hero, which boosts our attack speed, armor and evasion, and makes us immune to stuns since we're always fortified. By picking up Conqueror, we take reduced damage if we taunted enemies recently, and we taunt every time we hit. This build also uses Arctic Armor, causing us to take less physical and fire damage while we're standing still. We also get freeze immunity from the buff. In addition to taking less damage, we also cause enemies to deal less damage. Algar Mortis allows us to inflict sap on enemies with our lightning damage when they're in our chilling areas, causing them to deal less damage. We've taken Inspirational from the Champion Ascendancy, which lets us run Defiance Banner without a reservation cost. And in addition to giving us some armor and evasion and reducing enemy critical strike chance, planting the banner can further cause enemies to deal less damage. Additionally, we incorporate Sigil of Power, a spell that puts a circular area on the ground that gains stages as we spend mana. This skill helps boost our lightning damage while at the same time causing enemies to deal even less damage when they're in the sigil's area. Since we spend a large amount of mana, charging up the stages of the sigil is no problem, even with a high level gem. Alternatively, instead of sigil power, we can use Frost Shield to place a dome that absorbs incoming damage while we stand inside of it. Another way to let us sneak in a few extra moments to attack. Now, we're going to slow enemies down on top of all of that. Since we're using Arctic armor, enemies are chilled for maximum effect when they hit us, lowering their action speed even further. This is only for a short time, so for more reliable uptime on chill effects, Arctic armor drops chilled ground as we move. We also leave chilling areas with Frost Blink, as well as when we're hit because of the Commandment of Spite enchant on our gloves. We curse enemies and lower their action speed with Temporal Chains on hit, which we can get from a corruption on our gloves. That's not all, because nearby enemies are also hindered, causing them to move slowly thanks to the mod we get from Singularity. Inevitably, though, we're going to get hit. So what do we have in terms of recovery? Atziri's Splendor gives us a healthy amount of life gain when we kill enemies, great while we're clearing packs of monsters. We can run the Vitality Aura for life regeneration, which also enables us to get Life Leech from the appropriate Watcher's Eye mod. From the passive tree, we pick up Energy Shield Leech through the Light Eater notable, and while we're here, we allocate the Leech Mastery that makes a portion of our Leech apply instantly. Since we have Life, Energy Shield, and Mana Leech, this gives us a way to effectively gain all three of these resources on hit as long as we can leech. This build is pretty resist starved since we're using full uniques. To address this, we can increase all elemental resistances by helping Alira in Act 2's Bandit quest, as well as speccing resistance passives on the tree. We'll also need to pick up resistances on jewels and cluster jewels. Cluster jewels are really the only items crafted for this build, and we can use harvest crafting to get a decently usable one without too much effort. I recommend using Reforged Chaos and aiming for high tier chaos resistance rolls, in addition to all elemental resistance if you can. Lastly, our guard skill is Arcane Cloak, allowing us to spend a large portion of our mana in exchange for some flat added lightning damage and a buff to absorb a little bit of damage. To get a more nimble and responsive feel, this build uses Flicker Strike as one of its movement skills. Flicker Strike allows us to quickly close the gap to get into melee range. Since we generate frenzy charges by using frenzy, we can expend a charge to immediately flicker again if we'd like. We also get a movement speed buff for a few seconds after flickering, which helps us to get to the next pack more quickly. Combined with Frost Blink, these movement skills let us quickly move through the map or reposition in combat when the need arises. If you want a zippier feel at the sacrifice of damage, as well as control over movement, you can socket Lightning Warp into Kitava's Thirst to make Frenzy feel like a lightning-based Flicker Strike. I think this build does a decent job at capturing the Spellblade feel and character fantasy. By using Surging Thoughts, all our attacks, Flicker Strike, Frenzy, and Smite, have a chance to trigger spells from Kitava's Thirst. Flicker Strike feels fun to use, even though it isn't at insane speed. In this setup, it has a pretty good amount of impact when it triggers Kitava's Thirst. You get a nice explosion of energy from Prismatic Burst and then arc chains through the rest of the pack. Since Flicker Strike and Frenzy are both supported by Prismatic Burst linked to Archmage, the effective trigger chance on Kitava's Thirst gives us a little more consistency for spell procs. Even when we buff ourselves with Zealotry, the mana spent from that also has a chance to trigger Kitava's Thirst. Simultaneously dealing damage while refreshing buffs definitely helps this build feel smoother. Overall for me, using effects like Blessings and Sigils to boost damage feels more fun than dropping totems, and I think it fits well thematically. Also, manually using Val Arc and Val Smite feels great. Having a powerful magical blast lends a lot to that Spellblade feel, and the build has enough cast and attack speed to make activating them pretty quick. On tougher enemies and bosses, our defensive abilities come into play to shape areas of added protection on the battlefield. These tools add a little more moment-to-moment engagement with combat. And despite foregoing the Grace Determination spell suppression setup, the defenses of the build still feel pretty good. I even leveled the character up to 100 while mapping since it was so much fun playing it. Though after level 98, I ran my T16s as magic instead of rare to avoid the occasional death. I think one of the biggest factors to making a multi-button build feel good to play is getting the control layout right. After testing a few different control schemes, here's the setup for mouse and keyboard that felt the best to me. I use a multi-button mouse. On left click, I bind Move Only, and on right click, I have Frostblink. On the first thumb button, I bind the main attack, Frenzy. This arrangement is much easier on my wrist during play sessions. Definitely avoid binding the main attack to right click. On the second thumb button, I bind Arcane Cloak. On the DPI shift or sniper paddle button, I bind Defiance banner, since you don't need to plant or pick up the banner that frequently. For the keyboard, I bind Flicker Strike to the A key, Smite to the S key, and Zealotry to the D key. For Val skills, I use Shift combo keys. Shift S is Val Smite, and Shift F is Val Arc. I leave those on the main skill bind row so I can see whenever they're ready to use. Holding Control shows the secondary skill set row. Here I load up Defiance banner, Control Q is remapped to the sniper paddle button, and I bind Sigil Power to Shift plus the second thumb button. What about flasks? These are mostly automated. Adziri's Promise is used when I hit a rare or unique enemy. The Granite and Jade flasks are used when I use Arcane Cloak. My Quicksilver is reused at the end of the flask's effect. This generally has high uptime while I'm mapping, so I don't need to worry about it too much. I also tried out the build on an Xbox controller, and it handles surprisingly well, probably because most of the skills have auto-targeting. Overall though, I didn't like the inventory management on the controller, and I wish that you could use the mouse in combination more with the controller setup. The POB link is in the description below. Some comments before you check it out though. First, the damage calculation doesn't seem to work with Kitava's Thirst. It ignores the fact that the spells are triggered and calculates damage based on self-casting them instead. I'd estimate that the actual DPS is at about 2 million or so. In the notes section of the POB, I expand a bit more on the trigger rate. Second, I provided level progression trees, but I'm no expert at good leveling setups. I'm pretty basic and use Freezing Pulse to level 28, then I swap to Armageddon Brand and Wave of Conviction and use those until level 62. You can start playing the build at level 62 when Surging Thoughts becomes equipable, but you'll need to substitute some mana focus items like Adziri's Foible and Dream Fragments until you can gain some levels and increase your mana pool. Also, make sure to level Val Arc and Lightning Conduit gems along the way before switching to the build. I hope you liked the video. I had a lot of fun putting together and playing this build, and I hope you will too if you give it a try. The core mechanic with Surging Thoughts and Kitava's Thirst seems pretty flexible. With some proper crafted gear, I imagine you could create some interesting fire, ice, or chaos themed variants. If you do, please let me know in the comments. I'd love to see the improvements you crafty and clever exiles can come up with. And with that, thanks for watching.